time to fuel your business success. Welcome to Harmonious at Lunch. We're bringing you bite-sized advice and expert conversations to drive clarity and growth 5 days a week. Make sure you join our Facebook group at humanopt.com/lunch, where listeners like you and our guests hang out so we can find harmony in business together. If you're building a business, you're in the right place. Let's dive in.
Welcome back into some more bite-sized business advice. In today's episode, we got a fun topic, 5 ways to make better decisions. We're talking all about decision making, which is always a little bit of a trigger topic for some people. So I'm excited to dive in with a very special guest, Cheryl Strauss Einhorn. Welcome to the show, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So this is an interesting topic. How do you find yourself becoming an expert on decision making? Tell me that story.
Yeah, it was really an accident. My background is in investigative journalism. I spent over a decade at the business magazine Barron's, which writes articles mostly about publicly traded companies. And I ended up specializing in what you might call the bearish company story, those stories that take a skeptical look at a company's finances or at their strategy. And when those articles came out, there was often a very outsized reaction. Sometimes the stock exchanges would halt the shares from trading. Sometimes regulators would get involved, like the Securities and Exchange Commission, or a company might get raided by the FBI. And for one company where I wrote a series of investigative pieces, the CEO actually ended up being sentenced to 10 years in jail. And although journalism really does celebrate truth to power, this sort of weighed heavily on me, the human toll of these stories, because when you write these kind of stories and there are these outsized reactions, you may be impacting somebody's retirement portfolio, somebody's ability to get up and go to work in the morning, or if you bought the product or the services that the company sold. And I was raising questions about whether or not the company was doing things that maybe they shouldn't. Now maybe you have concern about something. For example, one of the companies actually was the maker of diabetic test kits. Well, this is a product that millions of people use every day, multiple times, to get a baseline measure of their health. And so I started to really just think about, how do I know that I'm telling stories that are true, that should be told, that I'm marshaling the right evidence, and then I'm checking and challenging my own assumptions and judgments. And that's really how I started to think about, is there a way that I could have a decision-making system that really looks at these mental pathways, these cognitive biases that we all have that help us move through our day and make many decisions, but that therefore tend to narrow our optionality in how we see the world, so that we don't really take in new information and insight on a regular basis. And when I realized that there was no system out there to control for and counter these cognitive biases, I thought, well, with my background in research, maybe I'll create one. And that became my area method. And so it was initially to just do a more ethical job at work, but then I started getting invited to teach at Columbia, at the business school there, and then at the Graduate School of Journalism. And then I started having companies and individuals saying, hey, I hear you have a system for decision making that really addresses these unhelpful assumptions and judgments. Can you help me with my son's college application process, or finding housing for my aging parents, or the growth strategy for our business, and so on?
That's a crazy story.
Yeah.
My first reaction was, I hope you never write anything about this show, because I don't want to end up in jail. But my second reaction was, I can definitely see like the emotional and mental toll that could take on you, because although it's not necessarily true, the correlation is there between, I wrote an article and a CEO ended up in jail, or people's portfolios were affected. Like that, the mental toll of that is real. But for you developing the method, and I do want to dive in and hear about it, but I'm curious, like in using it, did you find that you had more peace in writing articles and just being a journalist in general, because you would evaluate through that lens?
I really appreciate that question, because it really did. It really has, throughout my lifetime since I pieced this together, given me a way to really thoughtfully check and challenge the way that I am assuming that the world operates. And it also is forcing me to write down and record what some of my questions were. What was the data that I found? How did I evaluate that data so that after a big decision is made, I can look back, and as the decision is playing itself out, I can ask myself if I asked the right questions, if I ended up with good luck or bad luck. And it can also therefore help me to further strengthen future directions. So I've found it to be a game changer. It doesn't always mean that you're going to have the perfect answer or that the decision is going to work out well, but I think it really informs how you're going about things. And I think it can give you much greater confidence and conviction that you're not skipping something and that you're thinking about the other stakeholders who are involved in your decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I just have to believe that nothing else matters when making a decision other than confidence, right? Like if whether you're right or wrong, as long as you're confident that you made the best decision you could with the data available or with the information present, it's way easier to swallow a loss or a failure, right? That to me is what keeps leaders up at night is, am I making the right decision? Am I missing anything? And it seems like this at least eases that worry.
Well, last week I was in London doing a day of training with female senior executives from around the world. And we were talking about good and bad decisions, which seems like such a deceptively simple question, right? But when you really think about it, who are you answering for? What time period? And how do you actually know? Because any moment in time that you assess a decision is like a balance sheet effect. It's just that moment. If you look at it in 2 weeks or in 10 years, you may actually ascribe an entirely different answer, good or bad, to it. And what they all seem to be saying is that it could be a decision with a bad outcome and still be a good decision if, as you pointed out, they felt that they engaged in a thoughtful and inclusive process where they gathered data, they checked and challenged the evidence, they took into account stakeholder perspectives, and so on.
I like that. All right. Well, we've wasted enough time on my nonsense. Let's hear let's hear about this method. Tell me about it. Give me the overview, and then we can dive into the individual parts.
Well, this particular method is called the AREA method, and the AREA is an acronym for the steps of the process that move your work from bias to objectivity. So the A in AREA is absolute information. It's up close on the target of your decision. So say you are thinking about expanding your business, it might be the actual growth pathways. The two different pathways that you're evaluating might be the absolute target, and you'd be saying to yourself, what is each of these pathways? What does it entail? Then the R is relative information. Those are sources related to the target, but not from it. And in this step of the process, you're really thinking about the context, the ecosystem, the environment that the decision operates in. So if you're looking at relative information related to your two different growth options, you might say, well, how have competitors handled this? Is there an industry map that I can see? What types of customers have they ended up with? What's worked in this area and what hasn't? So it's information from a context, from experts, and so on. Then the E is actually exploration and exploitation. I call them the twin engines of creativity. Exploration, you get beyond document-based sources to interview people, identify good prospects, ask them great questions. That gives you the interview quality. And so from there, you'd be able to say, okay, I've read about the opportunities. I've read about how they operate in the ecosystem where they are, but how does it actually work on a day-to-day basis and in the ground? So That is the exploration part. And then exploitation is a brand new part of decision making that I've included, where here is where you are checking and challenging and excavating your own assumptions and judgments. And I give you a series of creative exercises where you can look at the data that you've amassed and be able to understand its diagnosticity. So this may be things like a scenario analysis, or it might be something like a pro-con analysis, where you're really evaluating how a single piece of data can have multiple interpretations. And then that final A analysis thinks about failure to strength test your pathway forward before helping you come to conviction. And so there, in that step, at that late stage, you say to yourself, okay, I think I might want to go with option A over option B. You tell a story of how that decision may fail. It helps you identify vulnerabilities in your pathway forward so that you can shore them up and strengthen them, so that by the time you come to conviction, you've already worked out some of the kinks, not only showing you why you think the decision can succeed, but further giving you evidence that it's not going to fail in the ways that you've identified. So it builds in strategic stops. It gives you a way to check and challenge your biases. It makes sure that you move through the different stakeholder perspectives. And it really helps you chunk your learning to make your work for you.
Okay, so there's a lot there. That was a lot crammed into like 2 minutes. For people with small brains, such as myself, first and foremost, is there a resource that you have for the listeners to go learn more about this? Do you have books, videos? What is it, and where should people go?
So terrific. I have a website, Area Method, AREA method.com. There you'll find my TED Talk about the process. You'll also find information about 3 of my books. The first one, Problem Solved, is on personal and professional decision making, and it takes you with the Area Method through 4 different examples, 2 personal and 2 professional high stakes decisions, and it's filled with worksheets so that you can apply it yourself. My second book, Investing in Financial Research, takes the Area Method and applies it specifically to investment decision making. My third book, Problem Solver, is on my new research that there's 5 dominant ways that people approach decisions, and really shows you why, when you use a decision-making system, or really any knowledge system, why do you enter into it the way you do? What information do you tend to value? How much information? How much conviction and confidence do you have that you can identify your next steps? And so on. And then I have a new book that hopefully will come out later this year that's on artificial intelligence and decision making.
That's awesome. The 5 different, what was it? The 5 different decision types?
It's the problem solver profiles from my book, Problem Solver.
Okay. That sounds like a separate episode. As long as you don't hate me, I'd love to have you back and talk just about that. And then when your book's launching, let's have you back again and talk just about AI and decisions, because both of those sound equally fascinating. I would love to, though, let me pause real quick. For those of you listening, the website, all the links down below in the show notes, description, wherever you are. It's also on the screen, areamethod.com. So Cheryl, before we wrap up here, and in like 5 minutes, can we go through a high level, real-time example of running through the Area Method? I have a decision that is just burning a hole in my brain that I need your help with. What do I have for dinner? I know this is stupid, but I don't know that anything else we can get done in really 5 minutes. So are you want to play with me?
So the first thing I would say is that I have a couple of questions, 3 questions that I usually pose to people about whether or not they want to apply a system for decision making to a decision. Something like going and picking out what you're going to have for dinner. You know, if you don't like it, the stakes are low. Maybe you'll have to digest it before you eat something else. Maybe you'll be out a little bit of money or a little bit of time, but it's not really high stakes. So I define high stakes with 3 questions. The first is the outcome unknown? Is the decision going to have a long-term impact? And is the price of getting that decision wrong going to be costly? If those 3 things exist, I think it's worth taking the time to use a decision-making process. So that's the first thing I would say. Now, if somebody is a diabetic or needs to be gluten-free or has some other problem that makes picking dinner a high-stakes decision, you could certainly therefore still try a system like AREA. So do you want to give that a try?
I don't want to rain on your parade. I am both of those things, and dinner is still not high stakes. I don't care how you classify it. There's no such thing as high stakes dinner. That's not true. In this case, it's really not high stakes. But I think that's super cool too, because how often do you run into people where they make very low stake or no stake decisions high stakes in their brain? I mean, just that alone, your simple method there to clarify which one it is seems
Yeah.
like a game changer for a lot of people.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. So for some people, because we were mentioning about the problem solver profiles, some of those decision makers find making decisions very cognitively exhausting because they want to examine a lot of information and they have a real desire to prevent the decision from failing. For those types of people, something like dinner at the end of a day, when they've made decisions all day long, can seem exhausting. And maybe therefore they think it's a little higher stakes, especially if they're very concerned with what they put into their bodies. For other types of people, decision making takes a lot less energy. And for those people, they won't need at all to necessarily feel like dinner or almost anything else is that high stakes. They've got a certain internal barometer. They feel like they've got a very strong gut. It helps them to make decisions easily. And you know what? If they make a decision and it starts to go awry, the blessing that they face is that the next decision is always ahead.
That is very true. Yeah, I had a roommate in college that shall remain nameless. Everything was a decision. And I mean, like, do I get a fork or a spoon to eat this? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, painful. But what you're saying is, and I've seen leaders do this too in consulting with our clients, some things just don't require a lot of time and effort on a decision because the
Well,
stakes are so low. But
well, here's
please.
that's a matter of opinion, though, right? So what I would say is um, there's no one right way to make a decision, but there likely is for you.
Mm,
Right?
interesting.
So for some people, that delineation between high and low stakes is really easy. And for other people, it just really is not. And as you said, you had a roommate and you could see that that person probably really struggled with having to make all of those decisions that did feel quite weighty. So on your dinner, I'm going to help you out. I have a tool that I call the vision of success. Anybody can use this anytime for any decision, low stakes or high stakes. The vision of success inverts problem solving. Instead of saying, what should I have for dinner? Open-ended, no idea where that's going to go. You say to yourself, what has to happen in the outcome of this decision for me to know that it's been a success?
Mm.
And now what you're doing is you're identifying those components of a successful outcome. So you've time traveled over the decision. You're imagining that that decision is over and done. And you are asking yourself to really get clear on what success means for you in that particular instance.
Let's get a little meta here for a second. Is that a decision to determine what success looks like?
It is, because generally speaking, there could be 10, 12 different factors that
Mhm.
you would love to work out well. But the truth is, when you are ruthless about being able to figure out how to define that vision of success, you realize if this doesn't happen and that doesn't happen, maybe it's up to 3 components, then the decision is going to fail. If you can identify what makes the decision fail, you now know what you really need to solve for success.
Got it. I understand. So is this really more of a muscle that needs to be practiced than anything else?
I think it's a muscle that needs to be practiced, but I also think it's a skill because, like I said in the beginning, you will identify a whole bunch of things that you'd like to have happen. I'd like to make a lot of money. It should happen right away. I should never have to work again. Whatever those things are. But then when you say to yourself, what are the few factors that if they fail, I'm going to have a decision that's failed, then I think that it becomes much easier. And I think it's a mindset that you have to begin to work at. And I think the more that you use it, the easier it becomes, because it's not natural to invert our problem solving. We generally want to have forward momentum, not turn something upside down.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that and the tip of identifying high stakes versus low stakes, I think are great also in alignment with the area method. So for those of you watching, listening, again, all of that's down below in the show notes. Go check out Cheryl's website and learn more. Apply this to your business. Cheryl, I'm going to have leftovers for dinner. It was a really low stakes decision. There's absolutely zero chance of failure, and I'm going to love it. But I really appreciate you coming here and sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you. And leftovers is underrated.
I agree. I hope to have you back for those other 2 episodes in the future.
Terrific.
Thanks for being here. And thank you for watching or listening another episode of Harmonious at Lunch. We'll see you on the next one.
Another episode of Harmonious at Lunch in the books. I hope this episode made you think and you grabbed some actionable ideas to propel your business. Don't forget to like, comment your takeaways, and subscribe wherever you're listening so we can help more entrepreneurs just like you achieve harmony